And now we will attempt to get, we've got them on the line, we've got the ACCC. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Right, okay, now I'll welcome representatives from the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission via teleconference. So, are you there? No?
It's Mick Keogh here, Deputy Chair of the ACCC.
Thank you. All right. Sorry, I'll come to...
Sorry, there's a couple of others.
No, I understand. I'm just making sure that the telephone's turned on. I've just got to do the standing order bit, and then I'll come and we'll introduce who's on the line, okay? So now, I'll remind senators that the Senate has resolved that an officer of the Department of the Commonwealth or of a state shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and shall be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister. So the resolution prohibits only questions asking for opinions on matters of policy and does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. Officers are also reminded that any claim that it would be contrary to the public interest to answer a question must be made by a minister and should be accompanied by a statement setting out the basis for the claim. For the Hansard record now, could you please give your name and the capacity in which you appear today? So, I'll start with you, Mr. Keogh.
Mick Keogh, Deputy Chair, Australian Competition and Consumer Commission.
Thank you. Mr. Bezzy?
Marcus Betsy, Executive General Manager, Specialised Enforcement and Advocacy.
Thank you. And Ms. Ford?
Gabrielle Ford, General Manager, Advocacy, International and Agriculture.
Right, very good. Thank you very much. Now, I've got a series of questions. Now let's just start here. So now we had the Minister for Agriculture announced the Dairy Code of Conduct would come into effect on the 1st of July 2020, and that was done back on the 2nd of April 2019. You can concur that? That's correct? Hello?
Yes.
Yes. Is anyone there?
Yes.
Yes, good. Okay. Now, when it was brought forward, were there any effects on existing negotiations or existing contracts?
I'm not absolutely sure the context of that question.
Well, did it affect any? Yeah.
When it was brought forward, recognised that multi-year contracts would be in place and made some provisions for those so that they would come into line over time with the arrangements of the code. So when the code was first introduced, it applied to any new contracts entered into after that date or existing contracts that were renewed after that date.
Okay, so of the approximately 5,000 dairy farmers in Australia, how many of them would be enjoying more protection as a result of the code? Would you have any idea? All of them?
It applies to all of them except a very small number who would be supplying dairy processors that fall within the definition of a small business, in which case some of the provisions of the code don't apply. But broadly speaking, virtually all dairy farmers would fall under the provisions of the code.
All right. So contracts entered prior to 2020, do you know how long they are typically for and how many would there be? Do you have that info?
I don't think we can answer the specific number. Okay. We're aware that in the southern regions, most of the contracts were annual contracts that would be renewed or rolled over annually. And the further north we get, the more longer term multi-year contracts, either 3 or 5 years, become more common. And similarly in Western Australia, the multi-year contracts are more common.
Okay.
But we don't have specific numbers on that. That would be information individual processes would hold.
All right, thank you for that. Now, is the ACCC able to take any action for contracts which breach the code if the contract came into force before January 2021?
I'll refer to either of my colleagues who are more specialists in enforcement than I am.
Thank you. Who'd like to answer that?
Senator, it's Gabrielle Ford speaking.
Hello.
Hello. So for any contract that was on foot before 1st of January 2020, the code does not apply unless there is a variation or renewal of that contract.
Right.
So from 1st of January 2020, any contract that is changed or varied or renewed is subject to the code.
Now, I'll shoot blind here because Senator McDonald has been very, very vocal about some practices up there in Queensland with lactalis that were racing to force our farmers to sign up to extraordinarily unfair contracts and I think to Senator McDonald, so they could beat, is it because they could beat the code of conduct coming in? Is that correct?
That is correct. And the second part is that they were saying to people who were signing at that point, I've seen an email where they've confirmed that the contract would be compliant under the code, but now they're backing away from that and saying that that's no longer the case.
Well, okay, so, and I don't think this is any secret, and I'm sure the ACCC know what's going on here because we've been told you're looking into it. That's correct?
Senator, can I add something that's quite important?
Yes.
Marcus Betsy here. The whether or not the code applies, the Competition and Consumer Act applies, and there are obligations under that Act in relation to unfair contract terms and in relation to misleading and deceptive conduct and various other things, a number of which may be relevant to some of these circumstances. So the code is additional to the Competition and Consumer Act. It doesn't exist on its own.
Good. That's good, and you are onto that. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. That's great to hear. Okay. Now, does the code embrace all the relevant recommendations the ACCC made?
I think I'd take that. I think
That's you, Mr.
without
Bezzy?
having to check, I think it's covered pretty well all of them. We made about 8 or 9 recommendations by memory, and I think most of the recommendations we made have been covered by elements of the code.
All right. Well, Mr. Bezzy, just in case something might pop up.
That was Mick Keogh speaking.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Keogh. All right, that's great. But just in case we find out that they've missed one or something's happened, the committee has agreed upon questions, and I know you didn't take it on notice, but if you do need to come back, closing date of closing of business Friday the 3rd of July, if you need to come back to us with anything extra. I should have told you that earlier, sorry.
Yep.
So now I'm blind here, but I'm asking, does it pick up the issue of changes in trading terms as covered by page 162 of your report? Would you have that close by?
Look, I can get hold of it. But when you say trading terms, do you mean payment terms? In other words, the length of time?
I would assume that's what I mean. Yeah. And I didn't mean to sound like a smarty there, but yes.
Senator,
Look, I might have... sorry, Gabrielle.
It's Gabrielle Ford speaking. I'm sorry, could I ask the page reference again, please?
Yeah, page 162, and I'm sorry I don't have it in front of me.
Thank you.
All right, so I'll move on. So could you explain to the committee the concept of minimum price as expressed in the code and how it would help the farmers?
I'll have a go at that if you like. Mick Keogh speaking again. You'll recall that the background to the introduction of the code and our recommendations around it was the step down that occurred retrospectively in April 2016, first by Murray Goulburn and then by Fonterra, which effectively meant that farmers supplying those two companies incurred or had a debt to those rather than, in other words, owed money on the basis of the back payment or back casting of the reduction in price. The consequence of that was our dairy inquiry, and part and parcel of that was the development of the code, which included a whole range of provisions that set minimum standards for the contractual agreements between farmers and processors, because our observation was that there'd been significant transfer of risk from processors to farmers, and that was evidenced in a wide range of quite unfair contract terms, things like unilateral variations, loyalty payments that were conditional on signing up for the following year, and the ability to do things like retrospectively reduce prices. So those provisions were all part and parcel of the recommendation and specific clauses in the code. Have I covered the question or not?
Sorry?
Could you remind me?
Sorry. Yeah, I just didn't hear the last bit. Yep. No, that's helpful. Can you tell us how the minimum price as referred to in the code differs from a minimum farm gate price?
Okay, so the minimum price referred to in the code was a mechanism to create a baseline for the payments to be received by a farmer.
Yep.
The reality is, of course, that milk prices are variable by season. In other words, some price schedules have seasonal variation in them, and they're also variable by quality. So what we attempted to do, or what the code attempts to do, is to set a baseline under which the average price received by the farmer for the milk delivered for the season can't go under. Now, there are some queries and uncertainties around issues like adjustments for quality, for example, and those sorts of things, and the ability to translate a monthly price schedule to a minimum price. So we've provided some guidance in relation to that. It's certainly an area that there are some questions about, and we're trying to make sure we can get more clarity around. And I don't know if Gabriel wants to make a comment on that as well.
But can I just add there, Mr. Keogh, but as we have heard extensively today, I'm trying to work out how you can set the baseline when we have farmer representatives, groups and farmers clearly telling this committee that the processors are refusing to pay them even cost recovery, and in many circumstances the majority of the farmers are being paid well below cost recovery.
Yeah, Mick here speaking again. There's two separate issues there. One is the minimum price specified in the contract, which sets, as I said, the baseline that the farmer should receive for the milk for the year. And then the secondary question you've raised is whether, in fact, that price is considered fair. Now, that second question isn't dealt with by the code. The code doesn't make any requirements in relation to notions of fairness about the price that's received by the farmer.
And Mr. Keogh, thank you for that answer, because, and this is a comment from me, I don't expect you to respond to it, but it just goes to show how toothless the code of conduct is. It is just, I don't even know why anyone bothered to announce a code of conduct. Anyway, I've had that.
Well,
My
I
goodness
think I'd have to respond to that. The code, as I said, was developed to address a broad range of unfair contractual obligations that processors were imposing on farmers because of the dominant bargaining position that processors held over individual farmers.
What's changed?
Well,
what I've heard today is nothing. I must be in a different inquiry here. Hang on, am I missing something?
Well, the first thing that's changed is, for example, the first obligation of the code was a requirement to publish milk supply agreements on the 1st or before the 1st of June, which included a minimum price. That had never been the case in the past. In fact, there'd been considerable delays often in processors publishing their season prices, often after the 1st of July when farmers already had to have signed up. So the first step is that we now have a clear month when most farmers can consider what's on offer, and those offers now are transparent. They're not hard to get hold of. Anyone with an internet connection can obtain those prices. They can look at them, make comparisons, and they have that month to consider that before the commencement in most regions of the new milk year from 1 July. Secondly, the code has a range of provisions which you referenced that require minimum standards in terms of those contracts. We are currently in the process of reviewing the 100 or more milk supply agreements that have been published to determine the extent to which they meet or are in breach of those requirements of the code. And we will take action in the event we identify situations where they don't meet those requirements. So they are quite substantial changes that have occurred compared to what applied prior to the code.
So, Mr. Keogh, from evidence taken today,
Sorry,
very clearly, if you're getting screwed down where you cannot get cost recovery, how the hell am I supposed to sit here and think I'm on the same planet as you people when the farmers are not getting cost recovery regardless of how great a job you think you've done? You ever been in business, Mr. Keogh? Have you ever put your own money on the line? I have. Have you ever put your house and signed it up to a business and thinking every decision you make is made from what you've got in the bank or what you've got coming in or what you hope you've got coming in? You don't even have to answer. No wonder I get the cranks with you lot.
I will respond. I grew up on a farm. I'm a member of a farming family. I'm still involved in farming. I know absolutely what you're talking about, but I don't know that your comment is relevant to our discussion today.
Well, maybe you should have tuned in here from when we started at 8:30. Senator Canavan.
Thank you.
Give me a rest. My head's hurting.
Thank you, Chair. Look, I just wanted to start with a comment you only just made there. You said that you are reviewing the 100 or so agreements that have been published for their compliance under the code. How long have you been reviewing or auditing those 100 agreements for?
As I indicated, the requirement was that they had to be published by 2 p.m. on the 1st of June. So on the 1st of June, immediately after 2 p.m, we collected as many of those as we could obtain. And as I said, that amounted to over 100 Australia-wide. Many of those are up to 20 or 30 pages in length, and we have our legal people currently going through in great detail all of those. You would understand that will take some time. We can't just do it instantaneously. And I also make the comment that if we do identify breaches, that is a matter for the federal court to determine. So it's not, we can't unilaterally declare a particular clause in a code to be in breach and impose a penalty. We have to be quite careful in terms of how we go about that. But
Okay. And I realise
that process is occurring as we speak.
Okay, I realise you've only had them then, we've only been doing this job for about 3 weeks. But so far, has there any red flags or concerns been identified? I don't need you to go into specifics or particularly the agreements, but just a general question. Are there areas you think you will need to follow up after your initial review?
Yes, we have already indicated that publicly, and I can answer that, yes.
Are you able to indicate the general topics or areas where those concerns might involve? We've heard this morning about concerns around the use of the cooperative shield or safe harbour type provisions. But are you able to indicate any particular areas that are of concern?
No, I think I'd prefer not to indicate unless my colleagues prefer to chance a remark on that. We are necessarily cautious about providing information about matters of inquiry because of the legal implications.
Okay.
I might add, Mick, it's Marcus Betsy here. I think we could say that there are broadly 2 categories. There's content of the agreements, and then there's the obligations about publication. And whether processors have all met the strict requirements in relation to obligations for publication on the 1st of June.
Right, okay. I wanted to there was a comment, I think, around unfair contract terms, or maybe I'm getting this from another witness, but I wanted to clarify here, with the unfair contract terms legislation we have, does that cover many dairy agreements? Would they be under the thresholds, which I think from memory are $300,000 for a single-year contract, or under $1 million for multi-year contracts? Are they covered by those terms currently?
As you've correctly indicated, the current thresholds are for $300,000 for a single-year contract or $1 million for a multi-year contract. I note that unfair contract terms legislation is currently under review by the government. I should also note that in a follow-up to our dairy inquiry, we addressed the issue of unfair contract terms with quite a number of dairy processors. We considered we were able to do so because the contracts at that stage were not specific about their total value, and therefore it was considered that they may fall under the threshold and therefore could be addressed using unfair contract terms law. So we've certainly done or used the unfair contract terms law in the past in the case of a significant number of dairy processors, including Brown's Food, Lion Dairy and Drinks, Norco, Parmalat and Fonterra.
You seem to be talking in the past sense there that the value wasn't identified in say the contracts and agreements you've received recently. Do they have identified value figures for those contracts?
Well, again, I'd defer to Marcus or Gabriel, but I suspect now that we have contracts and they have a minimum price specified, in the event that means the total value of the contract exceeds the $300,000, then under the current unfair contract terms, I suspect there may be questions about the applicability of that particular legislation.
I might just add one slight twist to that. So the legislation applies to standard form agreements, and if the processor has standard form agreements with 100 farmers and there's 5 farmers that they pay less than the threshold amount to, in the way we interpret the legislation, it applies to that contract, to that standard form agreement. So our experience has been that it's often the case that there will be at least some farmers caught by the standard form agreement that fall within the threshold, and so that's why we've been able to use it in the processes that Mick has mentioned.
Okay. You're probably not going to have the answer to this now. I'm happy for you to take on notice. Could you, through this audit process, you've got these contracts, could you get the committee a figure on what percentage of those agreements are below the thresholds for unfair contract terms?
I think we can certainly take that on notice, Senator. I think one of the issues that we may run into is the volume is typically not specified in quite a few contracts. So that may be a complication, but we'll certainly take that on notice and look into it.
But it does sound like there's a fair chance that a large number of dairy agreements would be above the thresholds in the existing legislation. Is that a fair comment?
I think it probably is, and I would note that we have, in our submissions to the government in relation to the reform of unfair contract terms law, recommended a different approach to the threshold, that is to use the small business threshold applied by the tax office, which is 10 million annual turnover, which we anticipate would incorporate most dairy farms.
Thanks for that. So did you...
Yeah, just
sorry.
a couple of questions, Chair.
Yeah, and then I'll go to Senator Hanson.
Oh, terrific. Thanks. Thanks very much for being here today to provide evidence. It's Susan McDonald. Look, we've had a number of conversations and I've raised a number of issues around dairy contracts. So I don't want to rehash those, and I think you've touched on some of them already. I disagree with Senator Stool's characterisation of the code as being useless, because I think it has progressed us a long way down the pathway of being able to have some transparency about the contracts, about dual supply. That is a really significant one, because price is just one element of running an agricultural business, and so I think the contract, given it's only been in place for not quite 6 months, has already seen some real changes of behaviour. But one of the things that I've consistently raised is with the ACCC is that there just doesn't seem to be enough powers to enable the ACCC to do much more than to wave a cautionary finger. And so I am keen to understand if you have some very specific recommendations on what powers would be required to enable the ACCC to respond more actively and possibly even proactively to negotiations when we know that we have such an unfair power imbalance between processors and dairy farmers.
Thank you, Senator McDonald. I'm going to preface my comments by saying that, in fact, the code has introduced the ability to impose quite significant penalties for breaches of the code. Now, that hasn't been in place previously. We have had to take matters Previously we've had to take matters under the general competition law, and that has penalties associated with it as well. But the voluntary code that applied in the dairy industry up until now obviously was not enforceable and has no penalties. So the major change that has occurred is in fact the imposition of penalties associated with breaches of the code, and we are quite. The ACCC is not shy in pursuing those issues, and I note we had the same change occur in relation to the Horticulture Code of Conduct several years ago, and we have pursued and secured enforcement action and significant penalties under the Horticulture Code. So we wouldn't anticipate any difference in our approach to the dairy code.
Right. I was hoping for some more specific guidance. Thank you, Chair.
In relation to negotiations,
No, in relation to the specific examples that I've raised around behaviour and, you know, so it's the negotiating, the pre-contract period. That's the bit that I'm frustrated by is where I go for assistance for dairy farmers who are being heavied into signing contracts that aren't in their best interests. And there just doesn't seem to be anywhere. The Ombudsman's trialling a case now, trialling an example now, I should say. But we're yet to see, you know, where it is that the dairy farmers who are not well resourced, they don't have the deep pockets of processors or supermarkets, where they go for assistance that's not that's financially bearable, that's fast and that's transparent.
I wasn't clear from your question, Senator, whether you're talking about negotiations prior to entering into a contract or a dispute that arises during the contract's term. In relation to a dispute that arises during the contract's term, the code sets some minimum requirements there in terms of dispute resolution processes. The processor has to have those in place, and then if that's not satisfactory, the Ombudsman has a role, and so those arrangements are spelt out, but they of course apply to disputes that arise with the contract in place. In relation to the pre-negotiations, I think I'd defer to Mr. Betty again, because I think there are situations where there may be a role in relation to some of the work the ACCC does.
Well, I would add, Senator, that we would hope that the code changes the ground rules for negotiations by making transparent what is being offered up front and actually giving farmers, the farmers that have actually got a realistic choice of processors, and I recognise that's not everyone, but those that do can actually choose to go to a processor that's offering terms that farmer prefers. The other thing that the code has done, and this is a very important change in terms of evening up the bargaining power between the two entities, is it's got rid of the retrospective step downs and limited the circumstances in which unilateral prospective step downs in price are allowed. And as Mick said, there are now significant penalties, and what we're hoping the penalties will do is not lead to a whole lot of cases that we take, although we're very happy to take them, but they will encourage processors to behave in a more acceptable way, behave in a fairer way. And look, frankly, if they don't, they'll get a bad reputation. They'll also be undesirable for farmers to provide to be. Farmers won't want to deal with them. But more importantly, at the end of the day, there are the sanctions that can apply if under the code if they are misbehaving.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
All right, thank you, Senator McDonald. Senator Hanson.
Thank you very much. Under the 2018 inquiry, you said here the ACCC Dairy Inquiry Final Report 2018. Through this inquiry, the ACCC has analysed the performance of the industry and the structural and behavioural features which contribute to this performance. The dominant picture that has emerged is one of significant imbalances in bargaining power at each level of the dairy supply chain. This begins with the relationships between retailers and dairy processors and progresses down to the relationship between processors and farmers. The ACCC has identified a range of market failures resulting from a strong bargaining power imbalance and information asymmetry in farmer-processor relationships. These features of the industry result in practices which ultimately cause inefficiencies in dairy production. Neither the existing provisions of the Competition and Consumer Act 2010 nor a voluntary code of conduct sufficiently address these market failures. Can you tell me, since the code of practice has been handed down in January, would you change anything that you've said in your summary of the 2018 report?
No, noting that the 2018 report was pre the introduction of the mandatory code, so I certainly wouldn't change anything we wrote then, and our recommendation around the mandatory code was in fact to address those very issues you identified in our report.
You handed down 8 recommendations. How many of those recommendations were taken up in the present code of practice?
Well, I can quickly go through them if I can flick to them, or I can take that on notice. It depends how our time goes.
Mr. Kerr, isn't it just a simple answer of how many of them? I mean, we did talk, I asked earlier as well.
Yep.
Rather than go through them all, have they all been accepted? That was your question.
Yes. How many of your recommendations have been taken up in the code of practice?
Okay, well, I'll go through them. Processors and farmers should acknowledge in writing the terms and conditions of milk supply. So that was referring to the fact that in southern markets in particular, there weren't even any written contracts prior to the introduction of the code. So that has certainly been addressed. Processors should simplify their contracts where possible, including by minimising the number of documents and clearly indicating which documents contain terms and conditions of milk supply. That has been addressed. The code requires that the contract be a single document, not the situation that applied in the past where a contract would refer to, for example, a processor's supply agreement, handbook, and the processor could vary the handbook conditions, and that would mean a unilateral change to the contract. So that has been addressed in relation to the single document requirement. In terms of simplifying the contracts, we are considering that because, of course, the code requires that they be written in plain English and also negotiated in good faith. So we are looking at that particular aspect as part of our review at the moment. Processors should provide all contractual documents simultaneously before the commencement of the dairy season or contract term. That one has been addressed because, of course, in particular with the provision of the single document contract requirement and also the publishing requirement means all those have been made available to farmers now before the commencement of the dairy season in general, and that means the 1st of June publication requirement. Milk contracts should not, this is number 4, milk supply contracts should not include terms which unreasonably restrict farmers from switching between processes. They were referring specifically to the practice of having loyalty payments that were conditional on the farmer again signing up to a subsequent agreement before they received those. And in fact, that was quite common in the industry. And in fact, a lot of the processors were holding over loyalty payments to August or September of the following year until farmers had signed up. So the code bans loyalty payments that are linked or conditional on a subsequent agreement. Loyalty payments have to apply to the milk year to which the contract applies, and also if the farmer leaves prior to the end of the year, the loyalty payment has to be made available on a pro rata basis. So that one is addressed in the industry code. Number 5, the industry should establish a process whereby an independent body can mediate and arbitrate in relation to contract disputes. Again, that has been accommodated. Firstly, the code requires the company's dispute resolution processes to be laid out so the farmer is familiar with them. Secondly, it appoints an ombudsman or mediator, and that's through the Office of the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprises Office in Canberra, and those provisions are dealt with in the code. Farmers should ensure they have properly considered the legal and financial implications of their contracted processes. We believe the provisions of the code make that as easy as possible to do, but really that's an obligation on an individual farmer. And certainly the 1 June publication date means there's a full 30 days in effect, and also a 14 days cooling off period, which gives much better opportunity for farmers to consider those implications rather than in the past where they were virtually handed a contract on the death knell with the potential that their milk wouldn't be picked up the following day unless they signed up. So that's certainly been addressed. Farmgate milk prices, this is number 7, Farmgate processors should publish information identifying how their pricing offers apply to individual farms, etc. We believe that's been addressed in part with the minimum price publication requirement and the pricing schedule. I note there has been the development in the market of an independent advisor that has a calculator. This is called the milk to market calculator that allows that to occur. So I would think that in combination, the requirements of the code and the development of that calculator have addressed pretty much the ability of farmers to understand how pricing will apply to their individual situation. And then recommendation number 8 was a mandatory code of conduct, and those provisions have been dealt with, as I indicated, and the mandatory code of conduct has been introduced. So I think we could confidently say now that all of those recommendations from the inquiry have been addressed and predominantly through the development of the code.
So you're saying that the minimum price for milk is in that code, but it doesn't say the cost of production. So is that really protecting the farmer? The cost of production is going up all the time. The processors don't seem to be covering their cost of production. So what do you classify as the minimum price in connection to the cost of production?
Well, the minimum price isn't necessarily linked to the cost of production. The minimum price is what's agreed between the farmer and the processor in entering into the contract, and the minimum price provides assurance to the farmer that, for example, the events of April 2016 won't be repeated, which is where the minimum price changed very dramatically and had terrible consequences for both farmers and communities more generally.
In your submission here, you said the ACCC noted that deregulation led to substantial reductions in the retail prices of dairy products, particularly drinking milk. These reductions led to reduced wholesale prices and margins for processors, with many private label drinking milk contracts operating at close to average cost for processors. And you go on to say, although some farmers and their representative groups expressed their concerns that the dairying industry would be more profitable if not for the retail price behaviour and associated reduced margins to processors, the ACCC concluded that the introduction of $1 per litre milk or reductions in other dairy retail prices did not have an observable direct impact on farm numbers, output or profitability. So if the $1 litre per milk is what you're saying here, did not have an impact on it, then what has been the impact on the dairying farm numbers, output and profitability? In your opinion then, what has caused the decline in our dairying industry in Australia, if not the $1 litre milk?
Well, that's quite a complex range of issues, and certainly
Well, it's
we
in your
produced
submission.
a
I'm
very
sorry.
detailed report into that. I can make a couple of comments. One is dollar milk accounts in total for about 7% of the total dairy production in Australia. I know that it's a significantly more important component of the market, for example, in Queensland and Western Australia, but it is important to keep that in mind. Secondly, when we looked at the point of introduction of dollar milk, which of course was Australia Day 2011, and looked at the prices paid by processors for milk and considered any signals that we could see of a direct impact, there was no obvious change in the farmgate milk price at that time. The change that occurred was back in 2000 when deregulation occurred, and the market milk price, which was regulated and subject to quotas in terms of production, was done away with, and there's certainly a change in the price of milk at that point in time. The other point I would note is that in 1979-80, for example, the average production per cow was 2,800 litres. By 1999-2000, when deregulation occurred, it was 5,000 litres, and the last available number was 2017-18, where it was 6,000 litres. So whilst we certainly see a reduction in the number of dairy farmers, there's a complex range of reasons for that, including the productivity gains that farmers themselves have made, which has meant that individual cows and individual farms produce a lot more milk than they were previously able to. Now, in the domestic market, the demand for milk has essentially been flat. So that means, certainly on a per capita basis, it's been flat. There has been some slight growth due to population growth, but that certainly means in markets such as Queensland and Western Australia, which are predominantly domestic markets, there hasn't been any significant growth, certainly any significant growth beyond population growth in consumption in both those markets. And if you have a situation where dairy farmers and cows are becoming more productive, but the market demand is essentially flat, then the scenario that we've seen where there are fewer farms and a flat price or not an escalating price at the farm gate is what we've seen. More generally in the southern markets, the price is much more strongly dictated by global prices because, of course, it's predominantly an export market once you get into South Australia, Victoria and Tasmania. And certainly that's been affected by a range of external factors, the removal of quotas in the EU, the boycott of Russia, which meant the EU diverted its excess milk production to markets such as China, which were a significant international market for Australian milk. So there's quite a complex array of different influences have impacted on the dairy sector. And as I said, we looked very carefully at the information available either side of the introduction of dollar milk on Australia Day 2011 and did not, and I think you'll notice our words there carefully, did not see any observable impact as a consequence. The second issue, though, that I think is important to keep in mind is that when we looked at the flow-through of price from retailer to processor to farmer, we certainly observed that the price that processors negotiated with retailers, for example, the contracts between processors and retailers were generally written as a three-part pricing arrangement. So one part was the farm gate price for milk, and processors were able to pass that through and are still able to pass that through to the retailer, either through a true-up mechanism or through justification based on the cost of getting the milk at the farm gate. The second price, or the second part of the price, is the resin price, which is associated with the cost of packaging. And the third part of the price is the processing and delivery to distribution centre. So most of the, or virtually all of the negotiation between processors and retailers occurs in relation to the processing and distribution cost to retailers. The other two, the resin price, which is the packaging, and the farm gate price, are essentially taken as given. So, and as we saw in the example of Norco in recent times, those contract provisions allow the processor to increase the price where they need to obtain the milk from farmers. So,
we're very close to time. I thank you for your information, but I'm limited in time and questions. You put in your submission here, regulation of farm gate milk prices may pose significant risk to processors' export competitiveness and their overall demand for milk. If we in Queensland basically supply our milk for our own needs in Queensland, we're down to 300 dairy farmers from 1,500. If we don't supply the milk in Queensland, we'll even lose the processors because it's not profitable for them to be there. So if they move out, as there's talk that Fonterra may pull out of Australia. So therefore, the dairy farmers won't have anywhere to go. They will just have to shut down. So are we going to keep heading down the path of worrying about the export market, which is only about 30%, and lose our domestic market? Shouldn't there be, I cannot understand your reason about worrying about a farm gate milk price that may risk their export competitiveness. So shouldn't we actually ensure that the farmers are given a farm gate price for that milk that covers production? Is there any reason why the ACCC cannot look at the 8 regions across the country, put in a fair farm gate price based on the cost of producing that milk so that the farmers will get paid that by the processor, then the processor will pass it on to the retailer who then passes it on to the consumer? If New Zealand can sell their milk to the consumer for $2.50 a litre, comparable prices around the world in a lot of countries is $2.40, why can we not charge at least $2 a litre for milk in Australia, or $1.50 at least, what the farmers are asking for, to ensure that we have a viable dairying industry?
Well, I might just respond in two parts. The first part is the ACCC is regulatory agency.
Sorry, I would ask that if you could, Mr. Keogh, I'm sorry to come in over the top of you, but if you could shorten your answer to the most direct, please, because we really are over time. Thank you.
Okay, we enforce laws enacted by the government. We don't make them. If we were directed in regard to pricing of dairy by legislation, then we would do it. But we do point out in our submission there are a number of complications. One is that if the milk price in Australia domestically is regulated and lifted, that would reduce the competitiveness of export products, and that would mean more of that 30% that's currently exported would be directed back into the domestic market. Queensland is already in receipt of about 140 million litres a year of milk from the southern states. So if more of that milk from the southern states was not competitive in export markets and therefore directed to domestic markets, more of that milk would flow into markets such as Queensland. Now, to prevent that, of course, would require barriers to the movement of milk interstate, and that triggers some constitutional issues. So we just, in our submission, we point out the complexities associated with that particular direction. But whether or not that occurs is clearly a decision for government, not for a regulatory agency.
Well, the figures that I have here for New Zealand, $2.50 a litre they pay for milk there. Their export here, milk exports is 19.3%. Our exports is 3.2%. So basically we need to shore up and make sure we have a domestic market here and our dairy farmer, otherwise we're going to be importing milk from New Zealand. We've dropped from 12 billion litres before deregulation down to 8 billion litres now at the moment, and still dropping. So you're right, it does come down to legislation by the government, but were involved in that inquiry. You made 8 recommendations, so it basically does come down to you to look at the market out there, that it is in the best interest of the consumer, and your opinions are very important in this inquiry.
Right, thank you very much, Senator Hanson. Look, I'll have to thank the officers from the ACCC. I've got questions that I'll put on notice so we can get moving. Thank you. And if we can now call the department, and while we're waiting for the department,